17. Sugar, the forbidden fruit. Sugar. We hate to love it, and we love to hate it. Today, this substance seems to polarize the conversation as much as religion, politics, and sports, while it is found in abundance throughout the globe in countless food establishments. Is it making us fat and sick? Is it killing us? Is it harmless? Is sugar in all forms bad for us? Is sugar the real bad guy? Yes and no. Mad sugar, the refined and processed sugar so many of us consume today, disrupts the intricately balanced environments in our brain and body. It is a powerful epigenetic factor, for the worse. Unfortunately, processed sugar affects the brain in many toxic ways, and the more we eat it, the worse these effects get. Evidence suggests that processed sugar acts on the brain in ways similar to well-known addictive substances such as alcohol and drugs, where both the opioid, natural painkillers in the brain, and dopaminergic, dopamine pathway systems are upset, which can cause neurophysiological and structural confusion. This addictive process is part of the reward systems in your brain. Endorphins are peptide hormones that bind to the opioid receptors in your brain and act as neurotransmitters. Endorphins reduce the sensation of pain and affect our emotions. Exorphins, on the other hand, are compounds that we can eat that activate our opioid receptors, thereby giving us pleasure as we consume our food. A growing body of research indicates that these exorphins can be found not only in wheat and gluten-containing products, but also in meat, eggs, dairy, green leafy vegetables, chocolate, and green tea. In fact, they may be ubiquitous in our food supply. They appear to account for the desire to eat more of these foods. God wants us to enjoy eating. Mad sugars, however, hijack these natural reward systems, distorting the desire for real whole food and replacing it with cravings for processed and refined food-like products. Dr. Stephan Guyenet, a neurobiologist and researcher, suggests that the palatability of a food, regardless of its exorphin content, is a major determinant of the food's interaction with the opioid reward system. By manipulating the palatability of industrial food-like products, such as calculating the bliss points discussed in Part 1, food manufacturers go to enormous lengths to capitalize on the addictive properties of their wares. You are not your addiction. Nevertheless, sugar cravings and addictions are actually learned behaviors. According to recent research, the abnormal craving for sugar is not innate in children and adults. It is the result of the massive amounts of sugar being added to highly processed foods and drinks. The increasingly sweet MAD diet is driving the desire to learn to crave more and more sugar. Although it may not seem like it at first, this is good news. If a behavior or habit is learned, it can be unlearned. What we wire into the brain, we can wire out of the brain, because the brain is neuroplastic, as we saw at the beginning of this section. It can change. We choose to follow temptation. God does not tempt us. James chapter 1, verses 13 to 15. Even though it may be difficult to resist these foods, the mind is stronger than the body, and we can choose to overcome the craving and retrain our brains and bodies through our minds. Yet how exactly do we learn to love sugar? Sugar eventually ends up in the pleasure centers in our brains, such as the orbital frontal cortex, where we consciously experience the pull of the sugar rush. If this pull is repeated enough times daily, over about 63 days, a memory craving sugar will have been implanted in our non-conscious mind. For example, we eat a refined, processed donut at the office because that's what everyone does on Fridays. Over the next couple of days, we think about the donut, recalling its taste. This process of imagining activates the same pathways in the brain as though we were actually eating a donut. By day 4, we find ourselves craving a donut. On day 5, we buy and eat 2 donuts. And so this cycle carries on repeatedly for 63 days, after which we have willfully learned to crave donuts, entrenching this memory in our non-conscious mind. Next time we see a donut, we will definitely battle resisting it. The love of mad sugar is one of the roots of evil. Of course, there are sugars in real foods as well, such as honey and fruit. God created these foods in such a way as to give us pleasure when we eat them, just as eating them nourishes us and fills our body with good nutrients. In fact, we have sugar receptors all the way down the esophagus, which appear to be intricately linked to our appetites. Our taste buds in particular are designed to help us recognize and pursue important nutrients. We have receptors for essential salts, for energy-rich sugars, for amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, and for energy-bearing molecules called nucleotides. Not just our brains, but also our bodies show how God wants us to enjoy the pleasures of real food. We can essentially become addicted to anything, even kale. As my daughter Jessica often jokes, our family may have to go to kale rehab. We each eat about 2 large bunches a day. Yet, the 17 teaspoons of added sugar in a 20-ounce Coke is the same amount of sugar found in roughly 3 pounds of carrots, 7.5 oranges, 230 stalks of asparagus, or 531 cups of spinach, with none of the nutrition of those whole foods. We can eat a whole bag of oranges, which have natural fruit sugars in them, and technically consume a lot of sugar, yet these sugars are encased in their whole food packages and are full of fiber and nutrients that sustain life. And as anybody who has eaten a whole bag of oranges knows, this is a difficult task, and the end result may not be so pleasant. Mad sugars, on the other hand, are empty calories. When we eat these refined and processed sugars, we consume an excess of calories because sugars, both sucrose and fructose, such as can be found in the infamous high fructose corn syrup, or HFCS, block the signal in our brains that tells us we have had enough. Highly processed sugars, just like any processed and refined food products, actually disturb our taste buds. In 2001, scientists identified the actual protein molecule, T1R3, that detects sugar. When excessive amounts of sugar are eaten, this protein is disturbed, contributing to the development of a toxic sugar craving. Indeed, as we saw above, food corporations craft these food-like products in such a way as to get us to consume more and more of these empty sugars without realizing that this will make us sick. It can set up the conditions for type 2 diabetes, obesity, fatty liver disease, mental health issues, and tooth decay, to mention just a few of the health consequences of refined mad sugars. And this stuff is legally consumed by millions and given to our children as treats. God never intended for us to eat foods that will kill us. As Jesus himself said, "Which of you fathers, if your son asks for a fish, will give him a snake instead?" Luke chapter 11, verse 11, New International Version. God loves and cares for us and for his entire creation. He came to heal us and set us free, body, spirit, and soul. He made us more than conquerors through him. But we have to choose to follow his promises. We have to choose to change the way we eat, as we have to choose to give every other part of our life to him. Hungry as a horse, on high fructose corn syrup. Before entering the bloodstream from the digestive tract, sugar is broken down into 2 simple sugars, glucose and fructose. Each type of sugar performs different yet complementary functions. Glucose, which is produced mainly by the breakdown of complex carbohydrates, is the type of energy our body is designed to run on. Every living thing uses glucose for energy. Fructose, on the other hand, activates the taste cells found in our pancreas, a reaction that slightly increases our body's secretion of insulin, which we need to move the glucose into our cells for energy. This is a complementary relationship. Glucose and fructose are metabolized differently in the body. Glucose has been found to reduce brain activity in regions that regulate appetite and reward, but fructose does not. Fructose only weakly stimulates the secretion of insulin, a hormone that can increase satiety and reduce hunger. It also reduces the amount of the hormone glucagon, such as peptide 1, GLP-1, which contributes to a feeling of satiety. Researchers are concerned that fructose alone, as is found in processed HFCS, could significantly increase hunger and eating. Similarly, research indicates that glucose decreases cerebral blood flow in the hypothalamus, thalamus, insula, and the striatum, but fructose increases cerebral blood flow in these areas. Glucose essentially reduces activity in the hypothalamus, an event that is associated with feelings of metabolic fullness and satiety, whereas fructose has the opposite effect. It can make you crave more food. Likewise, the brain's response to fructose on its own produces abnormal activation in the nucleus accumbens, which is part of the reward circuit. This activation increases the desire for food, just as fructose's effects on the hypothalamus increase the desire for food. In fact, one of the main functions of the hypothalamus is to keep a handle on how much long-term energy is stored as fat, the conversion of extra glucose into fat for a rainy day, so to speak. The hypothalamus does this by detecting levels of the fat-derived hormone leptin. It also carefully monitors the body's levels of blood glucose, which, as we saw, impact feelings of satiety. When we eat, the hypothalamus sends out signals that make us less hungry. When food is restricted, the hypothalamus sends signals that increase our desire to eat, potentially leading to weight gain, obesity, and lifestyle-related diseases. Processed sugars like HFCS put these carefully controlled wired-for-love signals into disarray. One recent study has shown how a glucose drink can cause blood flow and activity in the brain areas controlling appetite, emotion, and reward to decrease with a feeling of fullness. Drinking fructose, on the other hand, continued to stimulate the brain's appetite and reward areas, and the participants did not report feeling full. They even said they could have easily carried on eating and drinking. Now imagine how a soda with HFCS can confuse the brain and lead to overeating. Talk about being as hungry as a horse. It's all about connections. The brain's many structures and circuits work on the principle of connectivity, which means all the parts work together in an intricate and balanced way. As I have noted many times throughout this book, this connectivity can be upset by toxic thinking and toxic eating. In terms of connectivity between different brain regions, glucose increases activity between the hypothalamus and the thalamus and striatum by providing energy. These regions are a part of the thinking pathway, known as the science of thought, that deals with our state of mind, connects existing thoughts moving from the non-conscious to the conscious mind, and determines cognitive fluency. Fructose, when it is balanced with glucose in real whole foods, increases connectivity between the hypothalamus and thalamus, but not the striatum, which deactivates once a person is full. This means fructose gives an extra boost to the dynamic and active regulation of what is coming into the conscious mind, what you are choosing to eat, say, for example, cake or kale. The conscious evaluation of this with existing thoughts. I love this cake. It is my comfort food, but I read how good kale is for me the other day, so I really should choose that. And the final choice made. I am going to eat the kale. Fructose is therefore more responsible for activating hunger by creating epigenetic conditions that increase the communication between the hypothalamus and thalamus, while glucose makes sure you stop eating when you are full by activating all three regions, including the striatum. Yet, when the fructose-glucose love affair, so to speak, is out of kilter, the connectivity between these regions is compromised. This feels like fogginess and lack of clarity and slowness in the mind. The fructose in the HFCS activates our hunger without increasing activity in the striatum, so we do not feel that full and continue to eat more and more of the food-like products. Similarly, the cortical brain control area, which is activated when we think critically and self-evaluate, is inhibited by fructose but activated by glucose. When we eat real food and think good thoughts, this area is activated correctly and enables us to balance our reactions to everyday circumstances. A healthy, connected cortical brain control area allows us to be both excited and sharp, yet cautious and wise, truly following Jesus' commands. Therefore be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Matthew chapter 10, verse 16. Mad sugars, on the other hand, significantly affect our critical thinking skills. In fact, since this brain control area includes sites important in determining how our senses respond to foods, the extent to which the public is bombarded with "eat more processed food" messages is alarming. What are we doing to our poor brains? As sweet as honey. God designed glucose and fructose to be eaten together, the way they are found in fruits and honey, in small controlled quantities and seasonally available. That is why they are so hard to obtain in nature. As Dr. Lustig, one of the leading experts on childhood obesity and sugar, notes, our ancestors could only access sugary foods as fruit or honey or other naturally occurring sweetener, and then only for a few months of the year. Moreover, within vegetables and fruits, fructose is mixed with everything it needs to make it beneficial to our bodies and brains: fiber, vitamins, minerals, enzymes, and phytonutrients, for example. The correct amount of these sugars in real whole foods activates the nucleus accumbens, hypothalamus, thalamus insula, and striatum in a biochemically balanced way. If, for example, you have just finished a power walk, the fructose will be turned into glycogen and stored in the liver until you need it, while the glucose will be used for energy. When sugar is eaten in fruit and honey, glucose increases production of insulin in a healthy, wired-for-love kind of way. The insulin enables sugar in the blood to be transported into the cells where it can be used for energy, increases the production of leptin, a hormone that helps regulate appetite and fat storage, and suppresses the production of ghrelin, a hormone made by the stomach that helps regulate food intake. Because of this reaction, after eating glucose, feelings of hunger actually decrease, unlike the aforementioned effect of HFCS. Yet today, refined mad sugars, primarily in the form of HFCS, are widely available and added to virtually all processed foodstuffs and drinks. Even regular table salt now contains sugar. Lustig certainly hit the nail on the head, observing that nature made sugar hard to get, man made it easy. Although we should be proud of many modern advances, the production of refined sugars like HFCS should not be one of them. If the liver is already full of glycogen from all these processed sugars, any excess fructose will be stored as fat. If this fat gets lodged in the liver, it can cause non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, among other health issues. Not every modern development should be embraced as progress. It is not that fructose itself is bad. It is the reductionist, lab-manufactured, biologically inappropriate amounts of HFCS and other refined sugars that is the problem. High fructose corn syrup, in particular, is a cheap sweetener. It is actually sweeter than regular sugar and is used in most soft drinks, processed foods, condiments, and, sadly, many baby foods. It makes sense economically for food corporations to use HFCS, yet it makes no sense biologically for us to consume HFCS or any other highly refined and processed sugar. As we have already discussed, not only does it overload the liver, but it also confuses the receptors on the pancreas's cells, as well as the taste buds, and neurophysiological turmoil ensues. However, HFCS is not the only bad guy. Any processed and refined form of sugar is toxic. Raw, unfiltered, and unprocessed honey, for example, contains royal jelly, bee pollen, and propolis, three major sources of antioxidants, vitamins, and minerals. These elements all work together in a balanced way, so there will not be any negative metabolic effects when incorporating raw and unfiltered honey into the human diet. When heated and filtered, however, the honey loses vitamins A, C, D, E, and K, various B vitamins, calcium, potassium, magnesium, and live enzymes. It becomes toxic to our health, just like HFCS. We are not supposed to have a lot of fructose floating about in our heads. Molecularly speaking, fructose has the same number of calories but is sweeter than glucose. Unlike glucose, however, fructose is almost entirely removed from the blood by the liver. Very little of it actually gets into the brain if we eat a balanced diet of real whole foods. When we eat excessive amounts of fructose in the MAD diet, more fructose enters the brain than it should, and problems ensue since our brain is not designed to handle large amounts of this processed sugar. The moral of the story is that when we isolate fructose in a laboratory, we disrupt the delicate balance of God's created foods. This is just one more example of a theme that I have discussed throughout this book. It is not the food per se, but what humanity does to the food. We would do well to follow the advice in Proverbs, chapter 25, verse 16. Do you like honey? Don't eat too much, or it will make you sick. New Living Translation. HFCS and AGEs, an alphabet soup you won't like. The manufacturing process for HFCS is different than that of table sugar. HFCS contains free and unbound fructose molecules that are more easily absorbed in the body. These molecules do not have to go through an extra metabolic step like other sugars. Fructose, as in HFCS, can cause up to 7 times more cell damage than glucose because it binds to cellular proteins 7 times faster. This is called glycation. It even releases more free radicals than glucose, which can cause tissue damage and aging. Normally, sugar binds to a protein under the direction of an enzyme, forming glycoproteins that are essential to the proper functioning of our body. These enzymes attach glucose to proteins at specific sites, on specific molecules for specific purposes. Sugar and protein are not, however, supposed to bind non-enzymatically. When they do so, say if you eat a MAD donut, the glycation of blood proteins takes place when the levels of glucose shoot up and stay high. The product of this non-enzymatic binding is a glycated protein called an advanced glycation end product, AGE. How do these AGEs come about? Hemoglobin is found in red blood cells, which carry oxygen throughout your body. When your blood sugar is too high, sugar builds up in your blood and combines with your hemoglobin. It has become glycated. Excess sugar molecules that cross the blood-brain barrier combine with proteins and fats. This reaction causes the proteins to fold incorrectly, and then they become less functional and even toxic. These dangerous new structures are AGEs. These AGEs affect how cells function, thereby causing damage to the body, which puts a strain on the immune system. AGEs cause inflammation, free radical damage and damage to blood vessels, and increased oxidation. All these can create major cognitive issues. This type of degeneration usually takes place over time. It can start as minor biological disturbances or disabilities and later continue on to become specific disorders, contributing to major brain degeneration and reduced mental functioning. Research shows that AGEs come from fats and proteins as well, not just glucose. Our body actually has a natural way of removing AGEs, since these glycated proteins form inside our cells as well, not just from our food. They are dealt with within the cell by being degraded and are flushed out by the kidneys. Zinc, insulin, and glutathione act as antioxidants, also fighting the AGEs that are produced within the cell. As long as our kidneys and intestines are working properly and our antioxidant systems are functioning, the majority of dietary AGEs will be eliminated very quickly. Unless, of course, we are eating the MAD diet, which puts all our bodily functions at risk by creating a toxic epigenetic environment around our cells. The fructose in HFCS directly affects the brain. It is believed to cause a sensation of pleasure and trigger a craving for more HFCS, without curbing the appetite. Essentially, it gives us a pleasurable boost without the downside of feeling full. So we think we can consume more of it, but in fact we are overconsuming empty sugar calories. High levels of HFCS in the brain have been linked to brain damage and depression. A number of scientists now believe HFCS to be more dangerous and insidious to our health than alcohol. Although people may feel a temporary high when they eat MAD foods high in processed salt, sugar, and fat, doing so on a regular basis will eventually lead to a learned craving that is self-destructive. Their brains have been altered, and now they feel like they need the food-like product to function normally. Indeed, because these foods create disarray in the brain, we crave more and more of them to try to get order back. Yet through choosing to change, this can be reversed because of the incredible process of neuroplasticity. I really cannot say this enough. We are not victims of our biology. We can renew our mind and remodel the biology of our brain. We are more than conquerors through Christ. Romans chapter 8, verse 37. What incredible hope there is when we apply God's principles and His science correctly. This is your reward circuit on sugar. Apart from regulating satiety, the hypothalamus, thalamus, insula, and striatum regions of the brain act as our metabolic analysis team. They read and analyze our metabolic state, and in doing so, help influence and balance motivation and reward. Glucose stops us wanting to eat more, as we saw earlier, while fructose increases our desire to eat. In real whole foods, their respective functions complement each other. Too much fructose out of the context of real whole foods confuses this read and analyze function, and we end up wanting more and more of the wrong foods to keep experiencing these reward highs. In a secular sense, scientists treat motivation and reward as though we are animals that can be trained. This approach is essentially defeatist and mechanistic. They see brain scans light up in the same regions as in a drug user's brain and label the sugar eater an addict. Indeed, as we have seen, several leading scientists and doctors believe that food addiction and even obesity are incurable diseases, and that they are just something individuals have to learn to cope with, usually with significant amounts of drugs involved. Yet our brains are designed to latch onto something: God. The more we align our thinking with God's Word, the more we will develop a healthy relationship with food, since we latch on to Him first and foremost. Become addicted to God, and all these things shall be added to you. Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. In His perfect design, motivation and reward come from the fact that we can be aware of our thinking and eating, bringing those thoughts captive to God, choose to override bad eating patterns, and build good eating habits into our minds. Why? Because we treasure our bodies, neighbors, and the whole of creation as gifts from God. Gifts we must steward wisely. To eat food is a beautiful thing, because God created eating and He created food. The shrinking hippo, campus. Dendrites are the branches on the top of neurons and look somewhat like branches on a tree. But do not let the simplicity of their shape fool you. Dendrites act like mini supercomputers and play a critical role in thinking and long-term thought formation. When we put our body and brain into toxic stress by unhealthy eating and unhealthy thinking, the hippocampal neurons became shorter and the dendrites shrink in a phenomenon called dendritic remodeling, which means that their supercomputer functions become compromised. This affects long-term memory. Furthermore, there are fewer synaptic connections and therefore less opportunity for optimal information flow. In turn, this affects information processing and short-term memory. In fact, the hippocampus is involved in processing information, converting short-term to long-term memory and spatial memory. So any damage here means that information processing is slowed down in all these areas, negatively impacting cognition. In the synapses themselves, the vesicles, which are like little bags of excitatory neurotransmitters, begin to dry up if we do not take our thoughts captive to Christ and if we continue to eat the mad diet. Because neurons use excitatory neurotransmitters to tell each other to increase their level of activity, fewer of these vesicles means that fewer signals can be sent, slowing down information processing. Toxic food habits can break down communication pathways and short-term processing, resulting in a compromised memory. When the hippocampus functions like it should, which happens when we think and eat properly, a neurotrophin, proteins that allow survival, development, and function of neurons, called BDNF, is found in large quantities in the hippocampus, hypothalamus, and cerebral cortex. It is involved in neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, and the maintenance and growth of many types of neurons. If there is not enough BDNF, then the thinking process and the formation of short and long-term memories will be negatively affected. The structure of our blood vessels will be damaged, our brain can become inflamed, and synaptic plasticity will be reduced. And, according to a recent study, it takes only 3 months of eating the MAD diet, high in processed sugar, salt, and fat, to lower levels of BDNF. Consuming food-like products instead of real whole foods actually affects spatial memory within 72 hours and other types of memory within 28 to 30 days. Imagine what a continual lifestyle of eating a MAD diet does. Those mad sugars. And the evil of decontextualized, processed, lab-manufactured HFCS continues. Fructose in excess and out of the context of real whole foods reduces blood flow not only in the hippocampus, but also in other regions in the brain. This loss of blood flow affects cognitive function. If you consume HFCS on a regular basis, for instance, you compromise the anterior cingulate cortex's ability to shift between thoughts, and you get stuck in your thinking. Inflexible thinking, in turn, disrupts your intellect and ability to think things through by considering all options for any given situation. Likewise, processed and refined sugars like HFCS also reduce blood flow to the fusiform, which is involved in visual processing and facial recognition, thereby upsetting the visual cortex. When there is reduced blood flow to these areas, the ability to recognize faces and process visual cues is damaged. This can affect how you relate to others. Simply put, eating HFCS can affect your relationships. Yet God's mercies are renewed each morning. Lamentations chapter 3, verses 22 and 23. Recent research has shown how a shrinking hippocampus and other damages caused by the MAD diet are reversible. Change your thinking and your eating, and you can remodel your dendrites and increase blood flow. This is truly God's grace in action. In a mad rush of insulin. Eating a diet high in processed and refined foods can also cause resistance to the anabolic hormone insulin, which in turn can contribute to the onset of chronic diseases and even early death. When the cells are saturated in excess insulin, such as when we eat a lot of MAD sugars, the receptors, doorways on our cells that let in the insulin are desensitized. The insulin cannot deliver the sugars to the cells, so now there is a lot of excess sugar floating about in the bloodstream, hyperglycemia. The pancreas then secretes more insulin, since the tissues cannot hear what is going on correctly, so they feel they need more of this hormone to do the job. The body compensates for excess insulin in the blood by developing insulin resistance syndrome, the precursor to type 2 diabetes. This will eventually lead to a state called hyperinsulinemia, too much insulin in the blood. Similarly, other hormones also become affected by the high levels of insulin in the body, and the process of metabolism is thrown into chaos. Needless to say, both hyperglycemia and hyperinsulinemia are bad news. In fact, they are major epigenetic factors in the development of type 2 diabetes. It is therefore not surprising that people who drink sugar-sweetened beverages have up to an 83% higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Other health issues associated with insulin resistance and high blood glucose levels include blindness, obesity, heart disease, nerve damage, cancer, compromised fatty liver, which is a precursor to cirrhosis and liver failure, and the formation of amyloid beta plaques, the hallmark of Alzheimer's. Some researchers now even refer to Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes. And pure sugar is not the only culprit. There is consensus among nutrition scientists that simple, refined carbohydrates such as white bread, pasta, and processed cereals are not good fuel sources, since they release sugar too quickly into the bloodstream. Their chemical composition, once metabolized, is not much different from that of pure sugar. They are often referred to as sweet poison because of their toxic effects in excess on the body. These types of food continually force the body to compensate by making the pancreas produce excessive amounts of insulin, leading to hyperinsulinemia. Like everything in the body, insulin in and of itself is important, and not just for glucose metabolism. It can pass through the blood-brain barrier and trigger neurological processes that are important for learning and memory if the environment in our body is healthy. However, consuming large amounts of mad sugars on a regular basis blocks insulin's ability to regulate how our brain cells store and use sugar for the energy needed to fuel thoughts and emotions, thus having a negative impact on learning and memory. Essentially, high blood sugar and insulin levels from eating incorrectly also upset the brain's neurotransmitters that regulate mood, thinking, and learning. The synaptic function between neurons gets disrupted, which directly affects emotions, memory, and thinking. The brain's connectivity is thrown into disarray, and this affects short-term memory and thinking since the brain cells will have trouble signaling each other. Indeed, hyperinsulinemia impacts the insulin receptors in the brain, including the hypothalamus. The brain does not respond well to the increased blood insulin, which signals the brain, along with leptin, if we are eating too much and putting on weight. Since the brain can no longer suitably detect excess fat production in the body, our response will be to eat more, and therefore gain more weight. A vicious cycle. Mad stress. We turn now from insulin to cortisol. While commonly known as the stress hormone in a negative sense, cortisol is actually an essential steroid hormone derived from cholesterol. It increases available energy by increasing blood glucose and releasing fatty acids from fat, which, in healthy doses, can do amazing things in our brain, such as promoting attention, storing memory, and maintaining a balance between healthy and toxic stress. However, when we eat mad foods, or think toxic thoughts, our cortisol levels are elevated and become toxic, impairing attention and memory, causing changes in the hippocampus, thereby affecting the conversion of short-term memory to long-term memory, and shrinking nerve cells, which will eventually die. Is it any wonder, then, that a diet high in fructose throughout adolescence can worsen learning, memory, and depressive and anxiety-like behavior, and alter how the brain responds to stress? The amygdala in the brain has receptors for cortisol and insulin and is therefore also affected by excessive consumption of refined and processed sugars. This structure is also part of the aforesaid thinking pathway, working with the hypothalamus to provide the emotional and perceptual information that puts memories in context. When our amygdala is affected by mad food-like products, we can become reactive and impulsive, since we no longer have strong emotional and perceptual clarity. To put it simply, thinking and emotions are affected in a negative way by anything that is not real whole food. The soul, stress, and sugar. As I discussed earlier, the hypothalamus is a central player in how the mind, soul, controls the body's reaction to stress and foods. The hypothalamus is actually referred to as the brain of the endocrine system. It integrates signals from the mind and body, sending them throughout our bodies so that we can react in an appropriate and functional manner, so that the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 16, New Living Translation. Stress, like real food, is not inherently bad. It depends on how we react to it. Stage 1 of stress is only short-term and makes us alert and ready for action. It is an appropriate response to certain situations. During this stage, corticotropin-releasing factor, CRF, is secreted from the hypothalamus and stimulates the pituitary glands to produce adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. ACTH travels via the blood to the adrenal glands, above the kidneys, and stimulates them to produce the stress hormone cortisol. On the other hand, if we react incorrectly to stress due to a spirit of fear, 2 Timothy chapter 1 verse 7, our stress reaction is prolonged and becomes toxic. According to one study, increased stress can potentially increase the risk of mortality by 43%, but only for the individuals who believed that stress was harmful for their health. People who didn't view stress as harmful actually decreased their risk of dying. Over the 8 years of the study, the researchers estimated that the 18,200 people who died from the belief that stress is bad for you. That is more than 2,000 deaths a year. This is a real eye-opener because it shows that how we perceive stress determines its impact on our mental and physical health. If you change your mind about stress, however, you can change your body's response to stress. Instead of viewing the stress response as negative, when faced with a stressful situation, you can view it as your body being energized to help you meet the challenge. Rethink the stress response as helpful. Imagine your pounding heart preparing you for action. If you are breathing faster, good. You are getting more oxygen to your brain. If we choose to react wrongly to a challenging situation, we will enter stage 2 of the stress reaction. During this stage, high levels of cortisol circulate in the blood for extended periods of time, in turn contributing to prolonged high blood sugar that can also lead to insulin resistance, prediabetes, and weight gain, since prolonged high levels of cortisol lead to the accumulation of fat instead of fat breakdown. In this toxic situation, fat tends to accumulate around the middle of the body and is a risk factor for heart disease. In fact, prolonged high levels of cortisol can in some extreme cases lead to Cushing's syndrome, with its characteristic fat accumulation around the middle and back of the human body, but not on the legs, which remain thin due to muscle wastage. If we continue to release cortisol, we enter stage 3 of the stress reaction, which can lead to adrenal exhaustion and eventually death. So a maladaptive stress response that arises from our perceptions of stress and from excessive mad sugar intake can interact to make us ill and gain weight. Likewise, both a bad stress response and elevated insulin levels from too much sugar intake feed back through the brain, especially the hypothalamus. These interactions are a profound example of the interconnected nature of the brain and body, and how both signals from our thinking, the 80%, and our environment, or in this case eating, the 20%, can influence our health both physically and mentally. Yet there is good news. Since the mind, soul, controls the brain, including the hypothalamus, the mind is the key to breaking the maladaptive stress-sugar cycles. We can choose with our minds how we react to the circumstances of life, including stress and the foods we choose to eat. I will explain in greater detail how we can overcome the stress-sugar problem in Part 3. Is sugar making you fat? The urgency of choosing good food and good thoughts is prevalent throughout the scientific literature. The science of thought and developing intellect has been a large part of my research. A growing body of research examining the link between sugar consumption and obesity, for example, has found a significant statistical association between these two factors, thinking and eating. The link is especially strong in children, where each daily serving of sugar-sweetened beverages is associated with a 60% increased risk of weight gain and obesity, and thus the diet-related diseases. These findings should cause us to question current business practices. How ethical is it to use children to determine how sweet or salty something should be, calculating bliss points so that big companies can make more money? How ethical is it to market mad foods to children and youth? Indeed, the mental and physical health effects of consuming mad, processed, and refined foods as a child can persist into adulthood. As investigative journalist Michael Moss notes in Salt, Sugar, Fat, How the Food Giants Hooked Us, the food corporations are manipulating or exploiting the biology of the child. How can we allow this to continue? Go mad and lose your mind? With the increasing rates of not only obesity but also Alzheimer's in our world today, allowing food manufacturers to sell products that can affect both our physical and mental health poses a threat to all. The number of people with Alzheimer's disease is projected to increase fourfold over the next 40 years, reaching approximately 14 million by 2050. The MAD diet affects the gastrointestinal GI system in multiple ways, including damaged memory, as we already saw. The exponentially increasing obesity rates within Western societies over the last 30 years have been a cause for alarm, yet primarily in terms of associated health problems like type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. However, recent research is showing how Alzheimer's disease and dementia are an equal cause for concern in terms of the MAD diet. Considering how over one-third of Americans today are classified as obese, there is a strong possibility these people will suffer from cognitive decline. More and more studies are highlighting the frightening association between the consumption of MAD foods, weight gain, and dementia. This body of research underscores the fact that the MAD diet has dire effects on learning and memory processes, which, if you recall, are dependent on the hippocampus. Excessive amounts of processed and refined foods actually accost the small intestine, which in response secretes elevated levels of amyloid beta protein. This excess amyloid beta protein moves through the blood, damaging the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is the brain's security system. It is a network of blood vessels lined with endothelial cells wedged tightly together, creating a nearly impermeable barrier between the brain and the bloodstream. Every thought we have and action we take involves precise types of communication within and between the nerve cells in our brain. The blood-brain barrier is how the brain separates itself from the natural chemical fluctuations that occur in the environments around the cells, which will affect this communication and therefore affect our thinking. The only things that can pass through the blood-brain barrier are very small compounds and fat-soluble molecules. These unfortunately include antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, alcohol, cocaine, and many hormones. Larger molecules like glucose or insulin must be carried across by proteins. A healthy blood-brain barrier allows essential nutrients to get in and blocks harmful substances. So what happens if it is damaged? Some molecules, like amyloid beta, are able to break down the blood-brain barrier. Amyloid beta in the blood from incorrect eating breaks down the tight junction proteins of the blood-brain barrier, It does this by reducing the gene expression of these protein junctions, gets into the brain, and damages the hippocampus. Because the blood-brain barrier has been broken down, there is an increase in the accumulation of amyloid beta in the hippocampus, which contributes to the development of dementia and Alzheimer's disease, which are characterized by amyloid beta plaques that cause memory and processing problems. Unfortunately, the story does not end there. The damaged blood-brain barrier now leaves the hippocampus and the other structures of the brain vulnerable to circulating toxins, like heavy metals and inflammatory markers, with resultant increasing levels of cognitive damage. The surrounding environment of the brain is no longer stable, and this can occur from both an unhealthy thought life and unhealthy diet, mad thinking and mad eating. If a mad diet becomes a lifestyle, the damage will continue. If unforgiveness, bitterness, toxic thinking, stress, and negative emotions become a lifestyle, the damage will continue. God wants us whole and healthy in spirit, soul, and body. Of course, reading all these studies can be frightening and disheartening, which is why I am glad I can turn to God. He has given us an incredible mind, which can change our brains. We can reverse this cognitive damage. We are not victims of our biology, of the food corporations, of the government, of our grandparents' eating and thinking habits. We are more than conquerors in Christ. We can renew our minds. We can change our biology. Prescribe produce, not Prozac. Although the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates famously said that food should be our medicine and medicine should be our food, only recently is the idea of food as medicine becoming a resurgent field of research. The fields of medicine and psychiatry are beginning to rediscover the many connections between food and mental illness after more than a half-century of depending primarily on prescription drugs for relief. Steve Holtz, summarizing Dr. Bonnie Kaplan's work in this area, hit the nail on the head when he said that we may soon see psychiatrists prescribing produce rather than Prozac. Kaplan's research, particularly in the field of learning disabilities, shows that eating correctly is, consistently and reliably, associated with better moods and mental health. These findings are exciting, since they lay the foundation for the positive effect of a broad-spectrum micronutrient approach to learning disabilities, as opposed to traditional medications that have a number of unwanted and dangerous side effects, including structural and chemical changes in the brain. Similarly, other researchers have found lower rates of depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder among those who ate a traditional real food diet of protein and vegetables, compared to people who followed a modern diet heavy with processed and fast foods, or even compared with a health food diet of just tofu and salads. We need to change the way we view nutrition science. Magic bullet methodology, where we praise certain foods and demonize others, fits comfortably within the reductionist pharmaceutical paradigm, and traditional scientific methodology, where drugs are typically single ingredient and independent variables are potentially manipulated one at a time. What is needed is multi-nutrient real food studies showing the impact of real whole foods, in context, on mental and physical health, if this is at all possible within our current scientific framework. Nutritional science, on the other hand, is almost impossible to do, and we are far better off eating foods the way they have been historically grown, the way God designed, with biomimicry-inspired improvements, rather than eating the laboratory-manipulated ones we have today. Now that we have discussed how proteins, fats, and sugars epigenetically affect our bodies and brains, we turn to a subject that has gotten a lot of attention recently. Should we or should we not eat gluten? We'll see that the concern over gluten sensitivity is valid, but its solution is not what is commonly recommended.